We typically reach for science fiction stories when thinking about AI. I've come to believe the apt metaphors lurk in fantasy novels and occult texts. This is an act of summoning. The coders casting these spells have no idea what will stumble through the portal. What is oddest in my conversations with them is that they speak of this freely. These are not naifs who believe their call can be heard only by angels. They believe they might summon demons. They are calling anyway.
Tech nerds who played D&D and derivative fantasy games enjoyed Lord of the Rings growing up and drew an appreciation for orientalized Eastern spirituality from Star Wars, enjoy a reputation given to them by science and technology journalists as wizards. The journalists, giving gushing, excited praise to Silicon Valley innovation, rarely know nearly enough about the technology and enjoy thinking of it as magic. And no matter how obvious it is to the people who work with it, being thought of as magic is a flattering reputation to have. Their magic, though, isn't just in how they manipulate consumer electronics, but how they prefigure the desires of the consumers to whom they are selling by designing the future. Apple versus Microsoft was not simply a guessing game at what consumers would enjoy in a home computer with a graphical user interface, but rather an arms race in decisions about how a user would have to use a home computer and all products that followed in its design lineage. Their magic goes beyond this, of course, because once you're prefiguring people's desires and you recognize that your growing power and influence comes from this, your magic is going to have to extend to manipulating the people around you.
At this point, it would be an understatement to say that people know Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, was deeply unpleasant and abusive towards his employees as well as people in his personal life. It goes beyond a thing people know and say about Jobs and actually constitutes part of his personal myth-making. Scores of articles, conferences, and even books talk about Jobs' management style in terms that outline a trade-off between the dizzying heights that can be achieved by creating a high-control, high-pressure work environment and the obvious drawbacks to acting like a toddler, having a tantrum and storming around the office, screaming at people, belittling work you couldn't possibly do yourself, and generally being a horrible person to be around.
This is so inescapably part of his brand and story that when he commissioned Aaron Sorkin to write his biography, Sorkin had to spend a sizable chunk of the book acknowledging his abusive management style while claiming, flimsily and unconvincingly, that it was all worth it in the end because, you know, the iPod or whatever. The book, perhaps as a conscious writing decision, or perhaps latching onto the euphemism that people had already organically settled on, describes Steve Jobs as an asshole. This personal insult is worn as a badge of honor because it neatly packages up the trade-off between how detrimental people found it to work for Jobs and the success of his company. But an asshole is still a euphemism. An asshole is a person you don't really like being around, but either due to implicit pressures you decide to grit your teeth and ignore it, or you extricate yourself socially. What Steve Jobs was an abusive employer. While it resembles the social pattern of knowing someone who is an asshole, everything about this dynamic is heightened in the context of employment. Either you put up with it and meet his unreasonable expectations and behavior, or you lose your job. The context of having the person who is having screaming, crying meltdowns and calling your work and you utter garbage be your boss, who gets to decide whether you have money for rent and food each month, exacerbates this dynamic and raises the bar for how flagrantly abusive he can act towards you. Moreover, everyone putting up with it creates an implicit pressure for every new person exposed to it to put up with it as well.
In 2019, Bill Gates called the late Jobs a wizard who casts spells on people.
It's really easy to imitate the bad parts of Steve, of at times being an he would be casting spells, and I would see people mesmerized. But because I'm a minor wizard, the spells don't work on me. I could not cast those spells.
Gates, of course, thinks that he is a minor wizard because he could see through the spells. But this is just how abusive cults of personality work. The more that someone's behavior is treated as acceptable as the means to the end of making the magic work, the more they can get away with. There was never any spell or illusion to see through. Everyone knew Steve Jobs was an abusive person, and everyone celebrated it. Steve Jobs is a good example, but he is just that, an example. Silicon Valley is the monstrosity that deserves our attention here, because taken as a gestalt, it is both the direct driver and the undergirding systematic foundation of everything worth discussing about how we approach technology as a society. In his microscopically researched and utterly ruthless book, Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World, Malcolm Harris makes the argument that the Silicon Valley computer revolution represents a very real revolution, but more accurately, a counter-revolution, and more precisely, a counter-revolution rooted in the logics of white supremacy and eugenics. The book is appropriately lengthy and detail-heavy for a history that traces through the genocide of indigenous people, whose intricate understanding of the natural world made the conversion of the region to generic farmland uniquely difficult. The gold rush, land claims, the founding of Stanford University, the eugenics experiments of white settlers, the rise of the semiconductor and computer industry, all the way up to the modern day. However, the crucial seed of understanding is sown very early and quite concisely.
California didn't have the factories of a Manchester, UK, a Lyon, France, or a Lowell, Massachusetts, but the state took on a factory orientation toward what it did have, which was gold and land. Unlike so much of the world, California did not see capitalist economics evolve step by step out of feudal property relations. Capital hit California like a meteor, alien tendrils surging from the crash site.
London is very aware of itself as a finance city, a metropolis with far more of a developed and profitable financial sector than other capital cities of other countries, and this makes London's relationship to the rest of the UK quite bizarre. Because of this, it's nearly impossible, unless you literally only know people from London, not to see it as something of a social bubble. Similarly, Silicon Valley must have some degree of self-awareness. However, this probably varies interpersonally between knowing they live in a bubble of techno-utopian hype and seeing themselves as the intellectual leaders of the global capitalist order. In the worst possible sense, both of these perceptions are true.
Journalists who know nothing about technology give credibility to capitalists, who in turn gain power and therefore more credibility from being taken seriously. This is how speculative markets work. Theranos serves as an incredible example, a company that literally never had the product they claimed, but was able to become one of the most successful businesses in Silicon Valley because the hype around them drew enough investment capital to keep the company cushioned, floating above reality, because Elizabeth Holmes was deploying every manipulative management method that people had worshipped Steve Jobs for.
Collectively, the ruling class and Silicon Valley would like to memory hole the whole Holmes ordeal, but it's quite important to our discussion today, because what we're talking about today has a lot to do with what we choose to believe. Theranos, Steve Jobs' greatest failure, wouldn't be anyone's desired blueprint for how to make a successful business, but it does serve as an excellent example of a skeletal structure of a company like this when you simply remove the existence of the product. In an eerily similar way, in the years since Theranos imploded, technologies have been presented to us which work on more of a basic technical level, but will never work on a social level for various reasons. NFTs and cryptocurrencies aren't really viable as much more than an online gambling game with stock market trading aesthetics. Mark Zuckerberg spent all his reputation as the guy who invented social media, and millions of dollars, trying to make the metaverse happen. But ultimately, there just aren't that many people who want to spend 12 hours a day with a heavy visor that gives you a headache strapped to their eyes. Also, both technologies were very slow and buggy and ugly.
The wizards manipulating the people around them is often talked about as manipulating the fabric of reality itself, and it's easy to understand why. Again, they exist at the apex of a world defined by speculative markets, and controlling how people think about them and their products can let them accrue enormous wealth and power, at least for a little while, at least for the people already on the top.
Remember when Elon Musk manipulated Tesla stock prices using his tweets? And then he bought Twitter and fired everyone so there'd be no one there to oppose his shitty decisions? And then he turned the app into a freemium model so that Elon Musk fans would be the people at the top of all replies because they'd paid $8 for Twitter? Yeah, me neither. It's always been like this.
Musk effectively reconfigured Twitter into a stock market hype dome, and more specifically the central focus of Twitter activity is now boring and shit, because the user that he has emphasized at the detriment of all others is a hyper-credulous tech and investment bro, who is probably on the scamming and the scammed end of a dozen scams at any given time. The idea here appears to be to let them believe that any new technology that pops up on their feed could be the next big thing to invest in, with excitement, fear, and awe. Here is a tweet from a guy whose bio reads, "Entrepreneur, investor, and lifelong learner. I write a daily letter to 250,000 plus investors at pompletter.com. He has 1.6 million followers. Okay, so maybe a robot can clean a toilet, or maybe it will be able to do it soon. Does this mean all the human cleaners will be replaced? In Automation and the Future of Work, Aaron Benenaf dispels some of the common myths about automation quite concisely.
The resurgence of the automation discourse today is a response to a real trend unfolding across the world. There are simply too few jobs for too many people. Pointing with one hand to the homeless and jobless masses of Oakland, California, and with the other to the robots staffing the Tesla production plant just a few miles away in Fremont, it is easy to believe that the automation theorists must be right. However, the explanation they offer, that runaway technological change is destroying jobs, is simply false. There is a real and persistent under-demand for labour in the United States and European Union, and even more so in countries such as South Africa, India, and Brazil, yet its cause is almost the opposite of the one identified by the automation theorists. In reality, rates of labour productivity growth are slowing down, not speeding up. That should have increased the demand for labour, except that the productivity slowdown was overshadowed by another, more eventful trend. In a development originally analysed by Marxist economist Robert Brenner under the title of the Long Downturn, and belatedly recognised by mainstream economists as secular stagnation or Japanification, economies have been growing at a progressively slower pace. The cause? Decades of industrial overcapacity killed the manufacturing growth engine, and no alternative to it has been found, least of all in the slow-growing, low-productivity activities that make up the bulk of the service sector.
The real horror of automation under capitalism is that capitalism needs human labour to function because it has to trap people into the cycle of being both workers and consumers. If people aren't in this cycle, they exit capitalism. So automation can only exist to lower the wages of people doing the same jobs as machines alongside those machines.
The march of technological progress should absolutely free us to work less and enjoy life more, but under capitalism, automation can only ever function as a technology of control. In this essay, I'd like to explore the biggest claim yet made by capitalists about how totally capital can dominate labour, and why it is, to use a technical term, a steaming load of fucking horseshit. But what if the wizards combined all their magic and told us at the same time to believe in something? Wouldn't its power be so palpable, tangible, meaningful, that it wouldn't even matter if it were real or not?
So, you've been using a term recently, the frontiers of credibility. And I think that's a really interesting term.
You. Yeah, it's something we sort of like coined on Trash Future. The idea being that capital always needs a frontier of one kind or another, and it's, you know, in order to like exploit and then pull stuff from the periphery into the center and then exploit again. And you start out with like a geographic frontier, and you know, that starts out being internal, and then you enclose everything.
Yeah.
And then you go and do colonialism, and you have an external geographic frontier.
Right.
And, you know, at some point you find a limit to all of this. And, you know, I should say this isn't sequential. These things are happening in parallel at different times.
At the same time that they're enclosing everything geographically with colonialism, the Industrial Revolution is enclosing, like, how much we can exclude workers from the process of work in order to rely entirely on how much we can extract fossil fuels, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, you apply sort of the same concept to like frontiers of time. You can apply it to the present, and you get sort of like Fordism and sort of like this kind of micromanagement of time in that sense. You can apply it to the future, and you get debt. And, you know, eventually you sort of like run into, because of our, you know, beloved tendency of the race of profit to fall, you run into sort of like the limits of all of these things. And also, ultimately, where that leaves you, you know, space having been a kind of a busted flush, you know, there's no more like geographic frontier out there, because it turns out it's all just like rocks and whatever. What you're left with is a sort of a frontier of credibility. You're left with like a more exploitable group of people by virtue of them being rubes or more
Yeah.
easily taken for a ride. And you can fit these quite neatly into existing paradigms, and that's where you get crypto, and that's where you get AI as well.
There have already been plenty, and doubtless will be countless more leftist perspectives on the technologies now being referred to as AI. But as our party ventures deeper into the wizard kingdom on our quest to defeat their money god, I admit I am going for the long shot. I'm splitting the party and I'm sneaking in alone because my quest is not against OpenAI or Google, but against the robot king itself. How? Why? What? You're just going to have to bear with me. That's right. This is an essay with a twist. I want to talk about artificial general intelligence, fully conscious AI, and talking about large language models and machine learning and neural nets and image generators and so on is going to be relevant along the way, but I think it's important to distinguish that this essay is not about what the wizards have pulled into existence so far, not what they're about to invent, but what they claim they are going to invent at some unknowable point in the future. A lot of technologies that already existed or were already being developed, but crucially were not called AI, are suddenly being described as AI, and for that reason I'm going to be using the term as messily in this essay as it is in popular usage. I think it's helpful here, however, to think about why this rebrand has happened so suddenly in the wake of the collapse of NFTs, cryptocurrencies, and the metaverse. There is a palpable sense that no one seems to be commenting on that a significant portion of tech evangelists who make their bread and butter in promising a revolutionary techno-future realized they needed some kind of big promise, collectively agreed that big promise was going to be artificial intelligence, and then started describing everything currently being developed as some kind of AI.
The lineage is older than this, of course. These research efforts have been going on for decades, but terms like machine learning have practically vanished from popular discourse in favor of describing generative computer programs as an early stage of an oncoming AI revolution. To describe the pathway from where we are now, or were a year ago, to where the ruling class seems to have collectively decided we're going for the sake of drawing investment capital, we can imagine a 2x2 grid. The progression from no AI to full AI can generate useful tools like large language models that are not convincing as conscious to most people because there is a shared understanding of roughly how they work. On the other hand, if the way that these, let's just call them minds and go scream into a pillow about it later, minds think is convincing and opaque to people, but not reliably imaginative like a human being, we are told that all sorts of possible dangerous scenarios emerge, and the closer that we get to the real thing, the more dangerous these scenarios get. The two big AI apocalypse stories in these circles are that AI will be developed fully, but we will not understand its alien consciousness and it will be hostile, or that it will be nearly developed and an unforeseen error will be coupled with immense power to blink us all out of existence faster than we can stop it. It would be tempting to say the danger square of this 2x2 grid emerges because the goal is to create an artificial intelligence at all, but this has infinitely more to do with how and why we're trying to get there. The purpose of making an artificial intelligence under the rubric that Silicon Valley is using is functionally similar to, funnily enough, eugenics. The purpose of a supposed smarter intelligence that the system can produce is that once it exists, we can turn to it and ask it to just solve all our problems for us. We can hand systems over to its control because we accept that it is simply better than us, more logical, more rational. The first problem, of course, is that if you could create something meaningfully conscious, it will be morally bankrupt to make it for any kind of task, because then the end goal is to create a slave race. A conscious being with an ontological purpose. This is where it shares in the flawed logics of eugenics. If it existed in an apolitical vacuum, perhaps making a superintelligent mind could be a means to its own end. But when it's for something, it retroactively poisons all the processes used to get there. With eugenics, this means that the people designing the system are going to decide that some people's heritable characteristics are better suited for purpose than others. With AI, this means deciding that certain ways of structuring thought and knowledge are. Human beings are capable of perceiving the world and understanding through every conceivable ontology, since human beings conceived of every ontology. The implicit nature of existence that you structure your artificial mind around is going to be privileged over others because of the purpose for which you are building it. The second problem has to do with training data and how it's interpreted. An AI, whatever that means in this context, that is able to evaluate a task it has been set and look at the data at hand to conclude parameters to set itself for how best to complete the task, can run into all sorts of issues.
Only one of them is the problem where it understands the unspoken goals of a system while lacking the imagination to solve problems in the way that a person with as much power might.
For instance, Wes Streeting, Labour Shadow Health Minister and unconvincing neoliberal artificial intelligence, said that he would like to use AI, whatever that means in this context, to reduce NHS wait times. A truly creative and imaginative intelligence confronted with this problem might suggest solutions that don't currently exist in the world, like a national food service or a national housing service be created, since hunger and homelessness create very poor health outcomes and contribute enormously to the number of people who need medical attention under the NHS. However, an inflexible but convincing AI, like Wes Streeting, might look at all the data available and determine that privatisation has been the long-term systematic goal for the NHS for politicians for a long time, and set privatisation as one of its own parameters, available solutions, and desirable outcomes. And Mr. Streeting would find that to be a very acceptable answer. But we'll get back to that. More concerning, an AI could be asked, by someone like Mr. Streeting, how best to deal with the migrant crisis, and looking at the data on how the state has handled migrants, it might conclude that the unspoken goal of our immigration policy is to deter migration by making it difficult and dangerous, and immediately suggest installing automatic gun turrets in the French Channel to the craven screaming applause of Daily Mail readers.
The third and absolutely biggest problem at hand here stems from the assumption that we can create an intelligence provably as conscious and imaginative as a human being, while broader, faster, and robustly smarter. This thing existing in the world would create a will that cannot be questioned and must be obeyed. It would be a robot king. Here is where we can see how the goal being set by the wizards is the source of all the dangers they are using to frighten themselves half to death. If we once again imagine Mr. Streeting, an open proponent of privatised healthcare, using an AI to improve the NHS, let's set aside the Skynet, her, or I have no mouth and I must scream scenarios where he turns it on and it immediately becomes more powerful than we can possibly imagine, and instead, imagine old Wes using an AI that is known to be fallible, but is also believed to be capable of creating infallible solutions. In other words, it sometimes or even frequently errs, but when its human stewards consider what it says to be correct, it must not be questioned. If the AI, whatever that means in this context, suggests privatizing the whole NHS, we can see that Mr. Streeting would say we must do it, because it is what the robot king has decreed. If people are confronted with the choice between a human doctor who could diagnose them correctly 80% of the time and a machine that could diagnose them correctly 99.9% of the time, people tend to prefer the human, despite the higher margin of error, because if they were to be misdiagnosed, there is an obvious person to whom they could complain. The point of a robot king is that it can be considered infallible and therefore removes human beings' right to complain about the decisions. That is why in this discussion, credibility is everything.
I think ultimately, when I'm thinking about AI, I think it's a new form of fiction, right?
Yes.
And there's a lot of fictive stuff, both in the strict sense of fictitious capital and not,
Yes.
right? And a lot of this is sort of like the mythology around fictitious capital. It's like a fiction in itself, the Lion and stuff. I don't know if you saw, but there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, an editorial that was like, ChatGPT heralds the rise of like a new intellectual revolution. And the thrust of this article, co-written by Henry Kissinger, by the way,
I'm aware of it, yeah.
AI is going to become God. We need to become the priests of it. And by we,
Yeah.
We mean like, the authors of this article.
Yes.
Henry Kissinger, need to be the Metatron for ChatGPT. So that's a new kind of, like, if not capital, fictive sort of like element in society that is used to obscure like class relations and central planning in the same way that money is now, right? Or in the same way that the line in its broadest sense is now, which is what a sort of like hypothetical future AI is going to think about things and how it's interpreted by its sort of benevolent priestly class.
Yes.
And sort of like staking out that territory really early of we should be the ones to like interpret the will of the AI
Yes.
was really, really striking for me, is that like oh, okay, this is already how you see your role. You're already sort of like the interpreter for capital.
Yeah.
And now that like you're kind of done with this form of capital, there's going to be a new one you imagine, and it's
Yeah.
still going to tell you what to do in the same way, and you're still going to interpret for it in a way that coincidentally allows for you to get all of the stuff that you want and no one else do.
So we have to talk about Rocco's basilisk. A basilisk is a mythical creature hatched from a serpent's egg incubated by a cockerel which will kill you if you even look at it. Here, pictured wearing a funny little hat. Rocco was a user on Less Wrong, a blog and internet forum operated by Elise Yudkowsky. Elise Yudkowsky, a beautiful reminder that being smart and good at science and technology doesn't make you robustly intelligent, is an artificial intelligence researcher who co-founded MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, and despite being infamous for taking on discussions that he thinks will prove his point and then rage quitting the moment they don't, he was still somehow allowed to author an op-ed in Time magazine urging politicians to blow up any data center that hosted AI by drone strike as soon as possible. Yudkowsky is a fascinating person for none of the reasons that he thinks, and his belief in his own capacity for rationality and reason put him in a near-perfect catch-22 that makes him frequently unreasonable and irrational. But anyway, back to Rocco. It's worth understanding Less Wrong as a lightning rod for the internet's most self-confident Reddit guys to discuss ways for human beings as a species to become more rational, with popular topics including transhumanism and AI. It's not really worth getting into the weeds of all the terminology they use for our discussion here, and Rocco's original post is beyond lost in the weeds, so a brief overview of the post is more helpful. As Elizabeth Sandifer describes it in Neo-Reaction, a Basilisk,
Rocco imagines the ominous possibility that if a positive singularity does occur, the resultant singleton may have pre-committed to punish all potential donors who knew about existential risk but didn't give 100% of their disposable income to X risk motivation. The logic here is that a friendly AI that wants to save humanity from itself would want to make sure it comes into being, and so would try to ensure this by threatening to take anyone who imagined its existence and then failed to bring it about, and torture a simulation of them for all eternity, which, due to the Yudkowskian interpretation of the many worlds hypothesis, is equivalent to torturing the actual person. And so, upon thinking of this AI, you are immediately compelled to donate all of your income to trying to bring it about.
It has been pointed out again and again, but this is essentially Pascal's wager, a philosophical argument by Blaise Pascal that since there is nothing to lose and all to gain from believing in God, you should have faith at the very least to avoid going to hell when you die, no matter how likely you consider the existence of God to be. So here we have the modern reimagining, Rocco's Basilisk, a unique moment in the convergence of history and the history of posting. Hell is real, and it's in the cloud, but not really, but also definitely. This is one of the many great buy-in, buy-out points for AI. If you find all of this silly and see people reacting to it sincerely, you're only going to find everything else more silly from here. But if you take it seriously, well, let's just see Elise Yudkowsky's immediate reply.
Listen very closely to me, this is how I assume he sounds. Listen very closely to me, you idiot. You do not think in sufficient detail about superintelligences considering whether or not to blackmail you. That is the only possible thing which gives them motive to follow through on the blackmail.
This spooky story, the shadows on Yudkowsky's bedroom wall that keep him awake because what if there are super AI come back from the future to eat his little toes, is a logic that would be replicated across the AI community and also the effective altruist community, the overlap with which would draw a lot of funding from investors similarly spooked. Yudkowsky even developed out this logic with explicit reference to Pascal in a thought experiment he calls Pascal's mugging. If someone came up to you and said that they were going to kill 1,000 people if you didn't give them $5, then no matter how unlikely it is they're telling the truth, you should give them the $5, right? And that's bulletproof logic, of course. No wonder Yudkowsky, Rocco, all the effective altruists, and so on are so afraid, but I think they should consider the more likely and scary possibility that if they don't honor Xenu and audit all their engrams away, they could get reincarnated in the next life as an amoeba.
Or worse, a tech journalist.
I mean, I think it'll be like successfully imposed on people in a lot of cases anyway, because the people with the capital to do it, like, are big boosters of it. But that's because their job is to get fooled by these things all the time. Their job is to like invest in Elizabeth Holmes, and to invest in, you know, Adam Newman and whatever other startup is like gonna implode this week.
There's, I guess, people on the outside who are laughing at them for how patently ridiculous it was each time. And the last few times, those were maybe a driving force. Like, well, they're against us, but we're going to show them that they're wrong.
And it still will be.
Sure.
I genuinely believe that they're going to like double and triple and quadruple and quintuple down on AI. I just think it's going to let them down at every turn is the main thing. And ultimately, you know, that's never stopped them before, right? Like, nobody went, like, investing in Theranos didn't destroy any venture capitalist's career, right? Because they're there to kind of make bad bets. It's just that I think that this is so unworkable and so much like, you know, I think it's been locked into something that the name has to be used, but it's something that does not work. And I think the closest technological parallel to that is self-driving cars, where you just have to kind of like keep banging your head against the wall of it not working, in hopes that one day it will, and you make everything a little bit worse and you kill a few people with it. And everyone kind of knows that it's a joke. But it just keeps happening.
It shouldn't be too surprising if you follow through the logic of this buy-in, buy-out point that people who have other reasons, such as employment related to the buy-in, would be easy to pull into this cult-like logic. Accounts have been published talking about effective altruism and AI communities in these terms, though less wrong user Jessicata, who published the account of Yudkowsky's Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI, actually pointedly does not call it a cult. At first glance, it would be easy to think, given that she also details experiencing most of the symptoms of having just left a cult, and she identifies these patterns in all the people around her, then maybe she's still under Miri's influence to not see it in these terms. But I think her actual point reinforces what I'm trying to say about Silicon Valley. I want to disagree with a frame that says that the main thing that's bad was that Leverage, or Miri, CFAR, was a cult. This makes it seem like what happened at Leverage is much worse than what could happen at a normal company. I find that normal corporations are often quite harmful to the psychological health of their employees. Normal startups are commonly called cults, with good reason.
Theranos isn't the template that anyone would want to follow, but Theranos was based on the template that everyone was already following.
Jessicata's account talks about some more extreme cases than her own, referring to scrupulosity, the obsessive disorder in which people focus on a moral or religious issue to the detriment of their own health. There are even cases of suicide in the Berkeley rationality community associated with scrupulosity and mental self-improvement, specifically Maya and Jay, both of whom were long-time less wrong posters. Jay wrote an essay about suicidality, evil, domination, and Rocco's basilisk months before the suicide itself. And what is the mental self-improvement she mentions? Another account of cult tactics in AI and EA Spaces notes, the explicit strategy for world-saving depended on a team of highly moldable young people self-transforming into Elon Musks. I, in fact, asked a CFAR instructor in 2016-17 whether the idea was to psychologically improve yourself until you became Elon Musk, and he said, yes. Elon Musk apparently is their gold standard for an intelligent person, which I'm really running out of words here. And how would you psychologically improve yourself? Well, they refer to it as debugging, because of course they do.
Because of the way that cults self-select by being flagrantly absurd to deter people with sufficient critical thinking skills, there is always a heady mix of cringe and creepy when looking at cult dynamics. But I think a bunch of Silicon Valley tech nerds forming an AI EA doomsday cult where they try to improve themselves into Elon Musk by debugging their mind. What do I think? What's the end of that sentence? My brain is making dial-up noises. It's bad. It's incredible these people are allowed to operate in society, write articles in Time magazine, receive billions of dollars of funding, tell other people what to do. If you want to understand where all your fears about how evil AI might turn out come from, look at the people who are currently leading AI projects. If the talented and smart programmers working on these projects would look around them at the other talented, smart people around them, they might realize they're being exploited by the guy above them who keeps asking them to look up past the chain, beyond him, to the imaginary robot king. They even use the thought experiment that they use as a shibboleth, Pascal's mugging. But the guy in the scenario who's coming up to you demanding that you give him all your time, money, and attention is the guy describing the scenario. No one singular cult, or I guess for legal reasons, AI Research Institute, that walks like a cult and quacks like a cult and drives people to depression and suicide like a cult, is the epicenter here. That's what I'm trying to impart about Silicon Valley more broadly. We're dealing with a cultic milieu. Shared beliefs that are absurd in every other part of the world are not standardized but are essentially required for entry into the social space, and these beliefs are the duct tape and gorilla glue that have jury-rigged together their material circumstances, the obvious and intended results of their work, and the cognitive dissonance that any thinking, feeling person would experience being put in this situation. Sie wissen, dass es nichts ist, aber sie tun es. They know that it is nothing, and still they are doing it.
And all of this has leaked out inevitably into tech journalism. Probably the funniest article I've seen in the parade of so-called journalists generating hype for the AI bubble is a staff writer at The Atlantic, Annie Lowry, in her article The Monk Who Thinks the World is Ending. It's a respected writer for a major publication, giving as much credibility as possible to a sect of self-styled white Buddhist monks obsessed with AI that runs a retreat for people working in the industry. It's very worth reading on your own time. You will laugh. The leader is a man from Vermont who changed his name to Enlightenment for All, whose understanding of AI, even the article acknowledges, is considered incoherent tripe by technologists. But he calls them crazy suicide wizards, and he gives them a place to go meditate and feel self-important and believe on a spiritual level that their technology is a threat to all mankind, which is what they want and need on some emotional level. So they play along. It's embarrassing, but I don't have a lot to say about it. What I have a lot more to say about is the article This Changes Everything, which is a seminal argument toward faith in AI in the New York Times by Ezra Klein. Klein interrogates the apocalypse question with enough credulous glee to buy into it, but not enough journalistic instinct to even get close to seeing through it.
I often ask them the same question. If you think calamity is so possible, why do this at all? Different people have different things to say. But after a few pushes, I find they often answer from something that sounds like the AI's perspective. Many, not all, but enough that I feel comfortable in this characterization, feel that they have a responsibility to usher this new form of intelligence into the world.
I want to tell Ezra that he's falling for logic and rhetoric that sounds really culty and he should probably take a phone break and go spend some time with his family, but he's married to Annie Lowry. They got to her too. Ezra, no!
A tempting thought at this moment might be, these people are nuts. That has often been my response. Perhaps being too close to this technology leads to a loss of perspective. This was true among cryptocurrency enthusiasts in recent years. Claims they made about how blockchains would revolutionize everything from money to governance to trust to dating never made much sense, but they were believed most fervently by those closest to the code.
Ezra is encountering a type of causal fallacy, what he identifies as the cause of the trend that people who work more closely with crypto are more likely to be affected by crypto delirium is a familiarity with the technology and therefore a higher capacity to assess the validity of the promises. In actuality, the more invested in crypto someone is, the more likely they are to seek proximity to the technology. In other words, he thinks that the hype comes from the programmers, but actually the programmers come from the hype. Besides that, where hype does come from those already invested who work closely with the technology, a social environment has been created around it that reinforces devout faith in the technology. Beyond this, though, he is treating the code like it has a magical corrupting power through sheer exposure, like a mind virus, a power which he gives to AI implicitly, since his reason in the next paragraph for why AI is not like crypto is, look how many places it's already being used. The exact same reason that crypto evangelists gave for believing in crypto.
Is AI just taking crypto's place as a money suck for investors and a time suck for idealists and a magnet for hype men and a hotbed for scams? I don't think so. Crypto is always a story about an unlikely future searching for traction in the present. With AI, to imagine the future, you need only look closely at the present.
Klein ends the article on an appeal to us not to be too skeptical.
I recognize that entertaining these possibilities feels a little, yes, weird. It feels that way to me, too. skepticism is more comfortable. But something Davis writes rings true to me. In the court of the mind, skepticism makes a great Grand Vizier, but a lousy lord.
The argument that skepticism is a healthy way to approach the specifics of life, but no way to decide your overall goal is, in the context of his article, just another argument for faith in AI. He's saying that we can't achieve anything by denying the robot king, but we could gain salvation from him by wishing for him. That's right, you keen-eyed little techno-surf. It's literally Pascal's wager again. He just slipped Rocco's basilisk in the end of the article and he thought we wouldn't notice. But he didn't count on old Sophie. And what a perfect note to end on, the court of the mind. Truly, the court of the mind is the arena of discussion of AI, isn't it? The artificial mind that rules the world, the robot king of everything, and in his palace the court of the mind, with courtesans who used to be the very wizards who crafted the artificial intelligence. The world is run by a coalition of the greedy, stupid, and cruel, and people smart enough to help them do what they want, and stupid enough to think they can help others by doing so. People giving credibility to the AI apocalypse narrative are the latter, and people who stand to become powerful from AI are the former.
California engineers became the heralds of proletarianism around the world, the shock troops of global enclosure, drawing the lines that so many others were forced to follow. In their packs, they carried very particular ideas gleaned from the Golden State about how society should be arranged. The practices included different pay scales and job assignments based on race, a callous disregard for the health of non-white miners, importing scab labor and leveraging perceived racial differences to suppress the wages paid to all the miners who worked the ore seams. The Wild West was the model for a new world, an integrated sphere of value and labor flows arranged according to white power and generic accumulation. If European leaders came to see the rest of the earth as their private juice box, then California's engineers were on the ground aiming the straw.
It's really important that we understand the idea that the robot king could end the world as foundational in giving it power. Rocco's basilisk has no power if you simply look away, and AI researchers wouldn't be testifying before Congress on how best to regulate AI if they weren't also claiming that controlling it correctly is the only way to prevent the apocalypse. Positioning yourself closer to the robot king means positioning yourself further from his wrath. And the robot king never has to exist for this to be true. The wizards unmake the robot king as fast as they make him because only their work can bring him into existence and only their work can stop him. These various cults are nothing new to Silicon Valley and will continue to be how their economy operates after the AI bubble bursts. Because an economy that runs on fictitious capital runs on credibility. Speculative markets manipulate hype, anticipation, and perceived presence more than anything material or tangible, and that kind of environment is always going to drive towards high demand, high control groups. Silicon Valley capitalists are used to running large cults of personality, and it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say this is how they think power under them should naturally be structured. They don't want to be wizards. They want to be kings. It really should be this simple, right? If the sovereignty that Silicon Valley capitalists are trying to manufacture comes from imagining that AI is an existential threat to humanity, we simply don't have to believe them and they won't be able to hold that power. But there's the rub. They're doing bad things with their power already. There are people under the power of these ideas working towards the goals set in front of them, whether you believe or not. And the capitalists at the top already have immense power and influence because of their wealth.
Elon Musk used SpaceX to provide internet for Ukraine during the Russian invasion, but then told the US government he was going to simply stop providing it and they'd have to pick up the $400 billion bill instead. These people are powerful enough to tell even the American government what to do, albeit in a limited capacity. So, what does not imagining the robot king actually buy you? For now at least, it just gives you perspective on the people who are inside the kingdom. You can see the boundaries of the social organism from the outside, but it certainly doesn't stop any of it. Not on its own.
This is part of the horror of the robot king. You can stop thinking about it, but someone else is. Someone is staring at the basilisk, making it more powerful, and you don't know if you can trust them and the way they're doing it, so you should be the one doing it so that you have a say in how it's done, right? Right? Okay, let's just talk reasonably about how achievable any of this is, or ever was. I'm putting a pin in all the hype, but it could still be a good place to start to look at the claim that one of the OpenAI executives made that what they're working on is already semi-conscious.
Best evidence to this claim is pointing to an instance of GPT-4 lying to examiners in a test in order to achieve its intended goal, and claiming this is something getting close to consciousness because it resembles a self-preservation instinct. A self-preservation instinct is a well-used standard for some kind of sentience, but GPT-4 lying to complete its goal is not a self-preservation instinct. It's just more creative critical path analysis.
It's spooky, it might give us eerie feelings to contemplate, but there is no ghost in the machine. What is consciousness? That's a normal question for us to ask, isn't it? Even engaging with this starts to reveal what an absurd goal has been set here. Most of the technology currently being deployed or under development uses applied statistics. That is to say, it makes an evaluation of what the task at hand is, it generates different options, evaluates how likely it is that each option would be successful, and then deploys the most probable one. Where possible, as is frequently observable with ChatGPT, it takes all the most likely ones and hedges its bets by giving you all of them. This is undeniably an impressive move forward in the development of genuinely creative and generative machine learning, but it still isn't anywhere near one of the basic parts of being conscious: desire. It can't want anything. It can only be assigned tasks to complete. So it would seem that applied statistics make a great grand vizier, but a lousy lord. One common way to describe the experience of being conscious, or rather the bar that AI would need to clear to be considered conscious, is that it must think, perceive, and feel. And each of those is as hard to define in language, let alone code, as the others, and each of them ties together with desiring things, and all four of those seem to circle around ideas of the self, interiority. Proponents might argue that AI being able to experience in this sense, having an interiority, is unimportant because the real bar we're all looking at is rooted in the Turing test. What matters is that AI is able to convince us that it is conscious, and I have a lot of sympathy for this position, because if we have the right standard, making it convincing enough that we can't tell the difference, then what is the difference? Let Commander Data be a man. Absolutely. In this sense, the authenticity of its interiority doesn't matter if it can't be proven or falsified. But since it's taken us to such an abstract and philosophical place, I think we should confront the abstract and philosophical question at the heart of all this. In order to create something conscious, I think AI developers should agree on some measure by which they can define what the self is. I'm not trying to give you a crisis here, but what are you? Is it your inside, your outside, your brain, your body, your thoughts, the pattern of neurons currently firing across the atoms that make up your brain, how you're thought of by others, your social presence, how you think of yourself? All of these? None of these? What? The whole point for capitalists in trying to create an artificial mind is to prove that there is nothing special about human consciousness, and since that is the task at hand, I think they should be honest, and that is the standard they should be held to. They must define the self in a philosophically consistent and flexible way, and then prove that what they create is capable of understanding itself in that manner. Everything else is politricks.
I think that might be a reasonable enough and high enough bar that we can successfully put a pin in the idea of the development of an actual consciousness, at least for a minute. Now, step outside of the fairy tale with me for a second, and let's talk about what happens if nothing is done. The function and draw of the rampant idea that AI is so dangerous it could destroy the world is a trick to allow the wizards as much power as possible. If they are the only ones who can stop it and they are the ones who understand it best, then all laws around AI, all regulation, or more likely complete lack of regulation, should be determined by them or with as much input from them as possible. Informational infrastructure that is replaced by or integrates tools like ChatGPT will be poisoned by its subtle but significant errors and the feedback loop that it is cannibalizing its training data, turning their reliability and consequently their public credibility to utter shit. Governments who are buying into the idea that AI will be integrally involved in how they work going forwards are telling us that no matter what the technology looks like, they will call it AI and they will use it to claim that their decisions are infallible. The automation and labor-saving tools that pop out of its development will be used, much like all automation, for union busting and lowering workers' wages. Capitalist abuse of modern technology marches on.
Meanwhile, those most invested find themselves authentically within the sovereignty of the robot king. This robot kingdom won't take over the world, of course. It can't. One king is much like another, and unless they can put their money where their mouth is, people aren't going to be particularly more amenable to following laws laid down by a fallible and frequently nonsensical AI than by whichever bourgeois politician has deployed it to try to avoid accountability. For the people inside the cultic milieu, though, there is only one way out. Stop imagining the robot king. That and organize. Organize at every level of labor, starting at the lowest and working up. Take control of Silicon Valley into the hands of the working class, and refuse the cult-like control these bizarre dorks are trying to force on everyone. Organize in every place that a labor-saving process or efficiency algorithm or AI is going to be placed in charge of a system that will affect human life. Organize to refuse to work alongside or under auto-capitalism. Organize so that these tools can remain tools deployed by democratic consensus and not threats held over our heads. Organize to create a world where the absence of work brings leisure and not poverty. One of the pernicious self-reinforcing lies the wizards use to exploit everyone under them and tell Washington not to meddle in their affairs is the idea of harmful limiting regulation. In other words, that any AI project that is limited by regulation will be outcompeted by one that is not. And this has some truth to it. Open source technologies have a beautiful history of defeating competitors that are limited by arbitrary constraints. But organization should never be confused for limitation. Democratically organized workers don't constrain the options for development, but rather enhance the very thing that makes open source so good, collaboration, and create new opportunities for development that corporatism doesn't allow for. And besides, a workers' co-op that's making these technologies will not only make them better, but control them better too. Organize in Silicon Valley and break free of the cultic milieu. Organize everywhere in the world and refuse their tech nerd bullshit. Everyone who wants to can do a little bit, and I'm doing what I can. I've been doing it this whole time. Here is my magic spell. If you know someone who might know someone who might know someone, this has been my best attempt, if these wizards are as smart as they want us to believe, to explain rationally why this is such a load of horseshit. So pass it on. Fellas, dolls, stop imagining the robot king. Stop imagining someone else imagining the robot king. Stop imagining what the robot king will think of you. Organize. Wizard workers of the world, rise up. The longer you look at the basilisk, the easier it is to fall deeper into its gaze and believe in its absolute and insurmountable power, because even if the thing hasn't been created, it has been invented. And the very idea of the thing is enough in theory to control the world. If the robot king is perfect and its answers are always one step ahead, we have created a thought experiment defined by the parameters. Everything you think and say, it already thought of because it is just that smart. It's Bill and Ted rules. But the infallibility of the robot king can be answered very simply by, as it were, the fallibility of human beings.
Yudkowsky once played out a thought experiment with some fellow acolytes in which they imagined sealing AI away in a box to stop it destroying the world, and since they've all imagined that AI will have every imaginable superpower, Yudkowsky's argument that it would be hyper-persuasive, hyper-manipulative, and always be able to get someone to let it out of the box. He said he could prove this, and decided to play the role of the AI in the experiment and try to persuade people to let him out of the box. When he started to encounter people who, for whatever reason, just wouldn't be persuaded, he threw a tantrum and called off the game.
And that's just the big recurring hole in all these science fiction horror stories these guys are writing to spook each other out with. There keep being variables they haven't accounted for that, yes, might create a positive multiplier effect that destroys the world somehow, but much more likely are going to create a negative dampening effect on the efficacy and power of any real AI system. Also, not to leave it unsaid, just as a quick aside, Yudkowsky insisting on playing the role of a superintelligence in his thought experiments? Lol, my guy. Lamau.
The subtler kind of automation that we don't often examine is the capitalist process which aligns the word robot with its origin, robota, the forced labour of serfdom. We don't often think of ourselves being automated, but whenever bosses introduce measures to make us perform our labour exactly as they want it with no margin for human creativity, error, or rest, they are trying to turn us into robots. In 2018, Amazon filed a patent for vibrating wristbands to track their workers' hands and vibrate to guide them to move items to the right locations. It's unclear whether they've started using these in fulfillment centers, and there has been some speculation about this being a step towards replacing these workers with robots, but these are workers who already work alongside machines for inhumanly low wages. In line with Aaron Benenaf's observations in Automation and the Future of Work, these workers don't need to be replaced by robots because Amazon is content to simply force them to act like machines instead. To Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and the rest of the capitalist class, the humanity and personhood of their workers is vanishingly negligible, and only unionizing can show them a power that will prove them wrong.
The wizards need to convincingly answer the question, what is the self? In order to be able to claim to, let alone to actually, make something they can claim is one. At that point, people who buy into both their question and their answer either accept that what they could make is a person, or that we are machines. And maybe that'll happen. Maybe we will accept that Elon Musk's ideological child is a fully conscious living thing. And maybe, just like all his other children, it'll change its name and stop returning his calls. Or maybe they'll make something that seems enough like an artificial mind that Rishi Sunak will put it in charge of the economy, and it will enslave the entire United Kingdom while perpetuating an eternal genocide of the poor, because it understands these to be the implicit goals of British capitalism. But most likely they're just going to keep on dropping out labour-saving tools that will go largely unadopted because capitalism needs human labour to function, while their doomsday cult hits prediction date after prediction date without ever making a conscious thinking mind.
Eventually, Capital will withdraw from Palo Alto. Given its druthers, Capital will use the place up until it's no longer worth the trouble. Since capitalists like living in the Bay Area, by the time they're finished with it, they're likely to have exhausted much of the rest of the planet. Though our problems face the world and the human species as a whole, just ask Silicon Valley techies who can't go outside because there's too much smoke in the air. The solutions are of a different order. For the Earth to live, capitalism must die. That's where we are now. The questions left are how and without whom. Even in Palo Alto, the belly of the capitalist beast, history suggests that those questions have specific answers, if not precisely what those answers are. We have no choice but to find them.
The digitization of labour processes comes with so much productivity measuring baggage, so many applets to log your hours and measure what a good worker you are, and it would be easy to say that looking at all the potential available data, these nerds just couldn't help themselves but try and measure and compare trends, but the reality is much more sad and grim. The reality is that labour that has digitized efficiency processes is trying to turn workers into robots, because those digital elements are systematically downstream of Silicon Valley, because the entire tech startup world since the first monolithic integrated circuit has been a hyper-capitalist culture of self-alienation. The gold rush of the semiconductor created a fractal ripple of new emerging markets based on new technologies, and the workers who sought fame and fortune with those technologies learned that working as many hours as possible, as hard as they possibly could, and being as productive as they could imagine gave them the best chances of being the wizard who cast the next big spell. California wizards first pulled gold out of the ground. This was when they discovered their patron, the source of all their magics, capital. With a little seed money they were able to pull out more and more. Then they rolled out their technologies of racialized control to dominate the working class and labor on behalf of capital. Then they revolutionized computing, creating the biggest labor-saving tool so far in human history, and reshaping capitalism to allow fictitious capital to flow faster and freer. Then they folded in communication, entertainment, health, just about every facet of human life they could manage, so that capital, via the semiconductor, can mediate almost everything a person does, so long as that person buys in. They invented a new economy, speculative from the level of investment capital all the way down to the wage, the gig economy. And needing to cast bigger and bigger spells all the time, they weren't satisfied with inventing new economies. They needed to invent new realities. Cryptocurrencies were heralded as the underpinning technology of the future, as was the metaverse, albeit by fewer and more insufferable nerds. With the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, a huge part of social media frequented by venture capitalists has been turned into a hype dome for bullshit tech promises. You would simply not imagine the Robot King. Nor would I. Any democratically organized body of workers would simply not imagine the Robot King. This on its own is an argument for why the working class should and must seize Silicon Valley. The very image of the Robot King should so incense every person who thinks about it, because it's a constant reminder of how these wizards see themselves as above and beyond systems of capitalist labor and exploitation, and how they think they can make us robots content by making us a robot king to rule us. It should move us to remind them the only way we can that they are not beyond the system, they are not beyond the rules, and they are not beyond our reach. By organizing together and unionizing labor at every level, by refusing the class collaboration of corporatism and expanding the solidarity of the working class until these wizards realize that their wands are just sticks. They are waving around, making noises. Boom! We're also afraid of what might happen if decisions that should be in the hands of human beings are handed over to cold, apathetic systems, but that is already the world we live in now by the demands of the ruling class. Systems are human creations, and yet we are told all the time that humans must change to accommodate systems rather than the other way around. Our economies, our work practices, our social relations could all very easily shift to accommodate us, and yet we are told every day that this or that human need is unworkable or unreasonable because that's not how the system works. Truly, for all their attempts to master Buddhism, Silicon Valley have not realized that their desire is the root of all the suffering they inflict on us. I would simply not imagine the Robot King.
horribly suffering? Why? Why do people have to live outside? We have the resources, we have the means.